Well then, imagine, just for a moment, that you're not nestled in your modern bed with central heating humming gently in the background. No. Tonight, you're a medieval peasant. And yes, that's every bit as glamorous as it sounds. Welcome, friends, to another sleepy little detour through history. Tonight, we're bundling up and shuffling back to a time when winter wasn't so much a season as it was a multi-month survival challenge. You see, while knights jousted and lords feasted in tapestries and Netflix dramas, your average villager was just trying to make it through the night without freezing solid. Now, let's set the scene. Your home? A charming one-room hut, constructed from what scholars lovingly call wattle and daub, which is basically medieval for sticks smeared with mud and manure. Rustic, yes. Draft-proof? Not especially. The walls were thin enough to hear a bird sneeze 3 hedges away. Windows, if you were lucky enough to have them, were no more than holes stuffed with animal skins. And insulation, well, that was more of a concept than a reality. Whatever the temperature was outside, the temperature inside was politely, slightly less awful. At night, the fire in the hearth did its valiant best. But, let's be honest, it mainly roasted the shins of whoever sat directly in front of it. Everyone else? You might as well have been camping in a snow globe. And the clothing situation? It wasn't exactly cozy loungewear. Picture a couple of itchy wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled suspiciously like your neighbor's goat, and a desperate hope that layering would somehow transform you into a human radiator. Spoiler alert, it didn't. As for beds, forget duvets and memory foam. You got a sack, stuffed with straw, possibly a few old rushes, almost certainly a handful of fleas. Congratulations, you've earned the medieval bedtime deluxe package. Cold in this era wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an actual hazard. Frostbite, hypothermia, or simply freezing to death in your sleep were all on the table, especially if you were a child, elderly, or had the misfortune of being farthest from the fire. Waking up with all your fingers intact, frankly, that was worth a toast, maybe with a slightly thawed turnip. And if you've ever complained about your apartment's drafty windows, allow me to introduce you to the enthusiastic wind tunnel known as the medieval hut. Airflow wasn't just a design flaw, it was practically a feature. Every winter gust found its way through cracks in the walls, gaps in the roof, and holes you definitely didn't remember being there yesterday. Those charming thatched roofs you see in fairy tale illustrations? Well, give it a few months of snow and rain, and they began to sag, leak, and sometimes invited in local wildlife. Nothing livens up a supper quite like a squirrel landing in your soup. The floor? Ah, yes, the earth floor. It was, as the name implies, the actual earth, which meant that during particularly wet winters, your home offered the delightful ambiance of an indoor swamp. Medieval peasants didn't have water features. They were the water features. But here's the thing. They managed, with grit, creativity, and a kind of weary determination. Peasants turned their wind-whistling huts into semi-survivable spaces. They packed gaps with moss, stuffed rags into the worst of the drafts, and, most importantly, huddled close together, the original human-sized hot water bottles. So if your blanket slips off tonight and you get a little chill, just remember, somewhere in the 12th century, a family was probably spooning a goat for warmth and calling it a good night. Now, we already know medieval peasants were nothing if not inventive and stubborn. A truly heroic level of stubbornness, mind you. The kind that says, no, I will not freeze to death tonight. I have mud, goat hair, and just enough straw to make that someone else's problem. Yes, sometimes the only thing standing between you and becoming a human popsicle were creativity, sheer willpower, and a little sheep grease smeared into the walls. Insulation by animal residue. Charming, really. Very eco-forward. And as if the freezing air slicing through the walls wasn't enough of a nuisance, the cold below was just as insistent. You see, medieval floors weren't really floors. They were more like the outdoors but inside. Slightly flatter, sure, but just as likely to freeze your toes off. If you dropped something in the night, say your last hunk of bread, it didn't just fall. It vanished into the permafrost and joined the icy underworld. Farewell, snack. People tried their best, of course. Thick straw mats were a popular defense, if you could afford them, or perhaps borrow from a neighbor's hay pile during the night, purely for insulation science. These makeshift carpets added a bit of padding for about 5 minutes. Then they flattened, got soggy, sprouted mold, and started attracting tiny roommates with too many legs. Rushes were another option. People tossed them onto the floor, layering new ones on top of the old ones without bothering to clean anything out. Over time, this resulted in a kind of medieval mulch, a squishy, slightly aromatic stew of decaying plants, flea colonies, and mystery life forms. It was like living atop a compost bin, but with less glamour. Now let's talk beds. Yes, some lucky folks had them. But before you get too excited, let's clarify. Bed meant a wooden frame stuffed with straw or hay. That was it. No pillows, no foam, no thread count. Just crunch, poke, scratch, repeat. If you've ever rolled onto a Lego barefoot, imagine that, but everywhere. All night. Tossing and turning wasn't just a sign of restlessness. It was essential cardio. You needed to shift positions regularly, just to keep your limbs from going numb on one side while the other side froze in place. It was less peaceful slumber and more rotisserie survival. Still, peasants didn't conquer the cold so much as learn to sleep uncomfortably around it. A good night meant waking up with your extremities intact. And in the middle of January, that was basically winning the lottery. But every humble home had its saving grace. Its glowing heart. Its crackling champion. The hearth. Forget fancy fireplaces with marble mantles or brass fire guards. The average peasant's hearth was a simple pit, maybe a few stones arranged with deep optimism, and a modest pile of burning sticks that, if you were lucky, hadn't been damp for 3 days straight. It didn't just heat the home, it was the home. Your kitchen, your lamp, your entertainment system. Families gathered around the fire to cook, chat, tell tales, or simply stare at the flames in a dazed sort of silence that said, well, at least I'm not outside. And now, here's a fun twist. Most homes didn't have chimneys. That's right. The smoke just sort of figured things out. It might rise through a hole in the roof. It might seep through the walls. Or it might just linger, swirling gently into your lungs like a slow, smoky hug. By bedtime, you weren't just warm. You were gently smoked, like a ham, with fleas. But hey, bonus, the smoke did help fumigate those straw beds. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in wood smoke 24/7? Of course, keeping that fire going was a full-time job. You couldn't let it die out. Ever. Not just because relighting it was an ordeal involving flint, steel, splinters, and increasingly creative swearing, but because the moment the fire died, the cold came for you like a debt collector. So everyone pitched in, feeding the flames, watching the embers, adding sticks, peat, dried moss, or, if you were feeling particularly wealthy, a single log of actual firewood. The hearth was both lifeline and battleground, a place where human determination met the long, freezing night and said, not today, winter, not today. So, the fire. Let's talk about it like an old friend. Because, in truth, for medieval peasants, that's exactly what it was. A smoky, sputtering, occasionally rebellious little friend. Not particularly reliable, and not exactly low maintenance, but in the grand scheme of things keeping you alive, the hearth was somewhere near the top. Right after Don't Wander into the Woods at Night, and Please Don't Anger the Local Baron, The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, well, survival became more of a theoretical exercise. This humble little fire pit, often no more than a pile of tired coals in a smoky corner, was the very heartbeat of winter life. Now, losing that fire? That was every peasant's worst nightmare. Yes, even worse than running out of ale, because without that flickering warmth, the cold would move in faster than a tax collector on payday, and with just as much mercy. And starting a new fire from scratch? Oh no, that wasn't a quick click-click with a lighter. This was a full-on ordeal involving flint, steel, questionable tinder, a stiff breeze working against you, and the kind of prayers usually reserved for plague season. Doing all this while half asleep and shivering in the pitch black was less than ideal. Add a howling wolf in the distance for ambiance, and you've got the full winter peasant experience. So what did they do? They got clever. They banked the fire. No, not in a cozy put your embers into a Roth IRA way. Fire banking meant gently covering the glowing coals with ash before bedtime, tucking them in like fragile little dragons. The ash insulated the heat, allowing the fire to slumber quietly through the night, ready to be coaxed back to life come morning. When done properly, you could walk over at dawn, give it a little poke, toss on some kindling, and voila, flames, warmth, life. When done improperly, well, let's just say everyone was a bit colder and significantly more annoyed at breakfast. Banking the fire wasn't just survival. It was an art, passed down from parent to child like a treasured family stew recipe, except this one came with significantly more ash and fewer vegetables. Some swore by dry ash. Others insisted a hint of moisture was key. You could start a full medieval argument just by suggesting your neighbor's method didn't work as well. The 14th century version of a barbecue forum. And sometimes, despite all the careful banking, disaster struck. A gust of wind might snake its way through a wall crack and snuff the whole thing out. Or a particularly clumsy sheep might wander over and step directly into the hearth. Yes, that happened. And yes, the sheep was usually very confused. That's why some families took turns getting up at night to check the fire. Sort of the medieval version of adjusting the thermostat at 2 a.m. Except instead of arguing over 22 versus 23 degrees, you were arguing over live versus freeze. But fire was only part of the warmth equation. You see, when all else failed, and it often did, there was one ancient, reliable source of heat. Each other. Yes, friends, body heat. Nature's backup generator. The more the merrier wasn't just about parties back then, it was a strategic survival plan. Entire families would bundle together in the warmest corner of their little huts, stacked in like sleepy sardines. Imagine it. Grandparents, kids, neighbors, maybe a goat or two, all piled under scratchy blankets and layers of wool, forming what can only be described as a snoring, wheezing human lasagna. The lucky ones? They got the middle. Warmth on all sides. The unlucky ones? Stuck at the edge, flirting with frostbite, and probably regretting every choice that led them to that position. If you rolled over too suddenly in the night, you risked knocking someone, possibly Aunt Maud, straight into the freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations. You were now the villain of the family, at least until spring. Even the bedding was shared. A single straw mattress served everyone, slowly flattening under the nightly pressure of generations. And let's be honest, hygiene wasn't winning any awards. The smell? Let's call it robust. But nobody cared. Because when the wind howled like a banshee and the walls started trembling, you weren't picky about who you were spooning with. And they got organized about it too. Stronger, hardier folks were placed on the outside, forming a warm-blooded shield around babies, elders, and anyone who looked like they might sneeze themselves into an icicle. It was functional, strategic, and surprisingly sweet. And in the middle of all that crowding and shivering, laughter, singing, whispered stories. The kind of bonding you can only achieve when pressed shoulder to shoulder under one very itchy blanket, while sharing breath with someone's uncle and a slightly offended chicken. Because, yes, let's not forget about the animals. Livestock weren't just guests. They were part of the plan. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens. If it had body heat, it got invited inside. Not out of whimsy, but necessity. A goat in your hut was warmth, food security, and, if you squinted, security against theft. If the goat's in your room, it's harder for your neighbor to accidentally borrow it for stew. The result? Nighttime chaos. Pigs snorting near the fire. Chickens roosting on shelves. Cows casually reclining by the wall like they owned the place. It wasn't just survival. It was communal warmth with benefits. And, honestly, it kind of worked. So yes, the medieval peasant home was warm, but let's be honest, it wasn't exactly spa-like. Imagine being trapped on a long car ride with someone who forgot to shower for a few days. Now replace the person with a cow. Add winter, subtract deodorant, and remove the option of opening a window. Welcome to your medieval living room. By springtime, the aroma of shared survival was, how shall we put this, robust. You didn't need scented candles. Your home had already achieved its own, signature scent. But over time, peasants developed what can only be described as selective smelling. When you're surrounded by cows, goats, chickens, and 4 generations of unwashed relatives, you simply stop noticing. Or perhaps your nose just gives up. Because here was the unspoken truth. More animals inside equals fewer frozen toes. It was basic math. Cows were the warmest and got prime spots, usually near the family pile. Goats? Oh, they were coming in whether you wanted them or not. Might as well give them a blanket and some floor space. Chickens roosted in baskets or rafters. Pigs? Pigs did as they pleased, plopping down in the center of the room like they owned the place. Now, was it chaotic? Yes. Was it fragrant? Absolutely. But it worked. That said, sharing a bedroom with livestock came with risks. You might fall asleep peacefully, only to be startled awake by a chicken deciding your hair makes an ideal nest. Or step barefoot into a warm, suspicious surprise before breakfast. Medieval mornings, not for the faint of heart. Still, despite the occasional hoof to the ribs or chicken to the head, peasants made peace with their barnyard bunkmates. Because when winter came knocking, a cow's warm, slightly moist breath was the closest thing to a space heater they had. Now let's talk about winter fashion, medieval edition. Forget runways, forget brands. Winter clothing in the Middle Ages was less lookbook and more layer everything you own and pray it helps. The logic was simple. If you owned it, you wore it. All of it. Sometimes at once. Start with a scratchy linen undertunic, likely not freshly laundered. Over that, a wool tunic. Then another one if you had it. Throw on some saggy woolen leggings, a cloak that doubled as a blanket, and if you were truly living the dream, a sheepskin tossed over your shoulders like a status symbol made of mild discomfort. Stylish? Not particularly. Effective? More or less. It made you 10% warmer and 90% itchier. But you were alive, and in medieval terms, that was the whole point. Shoes were a luxury item. Most folks wrapped their feet in cloth or old rags, then shoved them into wooden clogs. If your toes still froze, you added another rag. And if that didn't work, you made peace with losing a toe or two. They probably weren't your favorite toes anyway. As for washing these cozy layers, don't be silly. Washing clothes in winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, cracking through ice, and hoping your one shirt didn't freeze into a woolly sculpture that took 2 days to thaw. So peasants often skipped that part. The result? A sort of earthy blend of smoke, sweat, and livestock musk that lingered all season. But here's the twist. That grime actually helped. Yes, medieval peasants were onto something. All that dirt, grease, and general crustiness, it insulated them. It filled the tiny gaps in their fabrics and made their clothing more wind-resistant. Basically, the peasant version of a waterproof jacket, just smellier and slightly sentient. They didn't wash themselves much either, and not just out of laziness. Many believed that bathing too often in winter could make you ill, so the dirt stayed, the oils stayed, the warmth stayed, and, let's be fair, it's hard to argue with results. Nobody froze because they wanted to be clean. Hats, gloves, and scarves were rare and highly prized. A single woolen cap might be the difference between sleeping soundly or waking up with your hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were homemade, often from leather scraps or sad little bits of cloth. They weren't pretty, but they were better than frostbite. And the children? Oh, the children. They were swaddled so thoroughly they looked like overstuffed turnips wobbling around the hut. Arms? Optional. Elegance? Non-existent. But if the kid was warm and waddling, everyone could sleep a little easier. So the next time you're fussing over your winter coat or rolling your eyes at having to wear 2 layers to the grocery store, just remember, medieval peasants walked around looking like laundry bags full of goat skin and hope. And they were proud of it, because in their world, warmth was the ultimate fashion statement, and dirt, oddly enough, was part of the design. So yes, it's fair to say that in medieval winter, a certain protective layer developed. A layer not of wool or fur, but of what we'll generously call environmental seasoning. Bathing was rare, laundry rarer, and soap? Oh, that was practically ceremonial. You broke that out if the bishop was visiting. Or right before you died. Whichever came first. Peasants had a strategy. They didn't wash away the dirt. They embraced it, layered it, let it accumulate like a badge of honor. New clothes? You didn't take off the old ones. You just added. Eventually, your outfit became a sort of wearable time capsule. Each stain whispered a tale. The muddy slip by the frozen well, the mysterious soup incident of last Thursday, that one heroic moment where you outran a chicken in the dark. To the casual observer, you might look like someone who had long since lost the battle with personal hygiene. But to the medieval peasant, that grime was tactical. That crusty tunic? A thermal force field. And besides, everyone stank. There were no scented body washes or crisp cotton sheets. Just you, your layers, and a whole village radiating eau de goat. In this world, filth wasn't a sign of failure. It was a survival strategy. And if, by February, you had a thick, greasy outer shell that deflected wind like chainmail, congratulations, you were crushing it. Now, let's talk about beds. Or, more accurately, piles of plants that tried their best. If you're picturing soft, downy feather beds with embroidered linens, let's gently pop that bubble. Peasant beds were usually wooden frames, if you were fancy, filled with straw, hay, or old rushes stuffed into a sack. No springs, no pillows. Just a crunchy, pokey collection of whatever had been recently harvested and not yet eaten by the donkey. And the noise. Oh, the nighttime symphony of crinkling straw, occasional creaks, and the unmistakable feeling of something sharp pressing into your ribs. Tossing and turning didn't just wake you. It woke the whole family, and possibly the chickens. Some folks skipped the bed frame entirely and just threw straw directly onto the dirt floor. This created what modern influencers might now market as an earth-connected sleeping experience. You, nature, and a few enterprising fleas all cuddled up together. Of course, the straw didn't last forever. Over time, it flattened, got damp, started moving on its own, and generally evolved into something you didn't want to share a bed with. Changing it was a big deal. Done a few times a year if you were responsible, or whenever your bed started whispering back. Rushes were another option. Long grasses spread thick on the floor, sometimes sprinkled with herbs like rosemary or lavender, to gently fight back against the overwhelming aroma of cow. Which was noble, but honestly they only helped for about a day. After that, it was back to ode a barnyard. Then, of course, there were the bedfellows, the ones you didn't choose. Fleas, lice, mystery itches. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations! You were getting the full medieval experience. And while these visitors weren't pleasant, they were consistent. Like roommates that never paid rent and refused to leave. Yet despite all of this, despite the scratchy straw, the itchy bites, and the scent of 3 months of shared human-livestock funk, those beds saved lives. The straw insulated against the cold seeping up from the ground. Huddling together on top of it trapped body heat in little pockets of shared misery. It was basically peasant, central heating, if central heating made noise, moved under you, and smelled vaguely like turnips. So the next time you curl into your memory foam mattress with a sigh of relief, just remember, somewhere in the medieval afterlife, a peasant is looking down at your perfectly fluffed duvet, grinning through a few missing teeth and whispering, "Must be nice." And speaking of nice, let's return to the house itself, or, more precisely, the fight against the cold inside the house. You see, when your walls are made of sticks, mud, and a healthy dose of wishful thinking, the winter wind isn't just a nuisance, it's a personal attack. Drafts didn't sneak in. They charged. Every night, the cold found new routes to explore, gaps in the daub, holes in the thatch, wonky corners where the mud had given up months ago. So peasants got creative. They stuffed every crack with whatever was soft, squishy, or vaguely fibrous. Moss, cloth scraps, grass, animal hair. If it could fit into a hole and maybe slow down a breeze, it was fair game. Some even coated their walls with a fresh winter layer of mud and, yes, manure. Imagine standing outside in the freezing wind, slapping cow dung onto your house while muttering, "This is fine, this is luxury." And you know what? It was. Roof leaks were a constant battle. Thatch was cheap and available, but waterproof? Not exactly. Patches were made with cloth, reeds, or in moments of desperation, chunks of turf quietly relocated from the neighbor's field. Over time, roofs began to look like someone had attempted a quilt, gotten bored halfway through, and let the wind finish the job. And doors? Windows? If you had them, you were already ahead of the game. Now, let's talk about medieval windows and doors, or, as they were better known, polite suggestions for where the wind might enter. If you were lucky enough to have either, they were often little more than rough wooden planks held up by iron nails, blind faith, and the collective willpower of everyone inside. Window holes were typically covered with animal hides or heavy cloth soaked in animal fat, not just for insulation, mind you. The bonus was a gentle, lingering scent of something halfway between beef jerky and mystery stew. It really brought the room together. Every night was a game of find the draft. You might be tucked in, finally warming up, and then, whoosh, a sneaky breeze would slap you across the face like a frosty ghost with a personal grudge. One missed gap, and suddenly your ear was a popsicle. But medieval peasants were not easily defeated. They patched, they stuffed, they smeared things. They layered their homes like they layered their clothes, with whatever was available and mildly squishy. Through sheer determination and muddy handfuls, they battled the cold not with luxury, but with persistence. And manure. Now, when the cold really sank in, the kind that crept into your bones and made your teeth feel loose, peasants turned to one of their most effective survival strategies: sleeping in shifts. Not because they wanted to, not because it sounded cozy, but because fires needed feeding. And nobody wanted to wake up to find the hearth dead and the frost creeping in like an unpaid bill. It wasn't a glamorous system. No schedules. No rotations pinned to the wall. Just, you sleep, I poke the fire, and then we switch when I can no longer feel my legs. Half the household stayed up tending to the embers, plugging drafts and dodging chickens. The other half curled under threadbare blankets and hay piles, hoping to snatch a few hours of what could technically be described as sleep. And once you were asleep, staying that way was another challenge entirely. Rustling animals, siblings rolling into your face, the eternal snoring of Grandpa Joris, who could rattle the thatch from across the room. Still, the system worked. Barely, but it worked. The fire stayed alive, the room stayed above freezing, and nobody had to try and restart the flames at 3 a.m. with numb fingers and a rock. Children learned early. No freeloaders in winter. If you could hold a stick, you could guard an ember. Grandparents were sometimes stationed at the fire, partly due to wisdom, partly because getting them up and down more than once a night involved approximately 4 people and a system of pulleys. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck. There were the snuffles, the hoof clicks, the wind, the snoring, and, if you were truly blessed, a warm goat parked suspiciously close to your feet. But even amidst the noise and stiffness, someone was always awake, always watching the flames, always grumbling, always swearing softly at the fire, always trying not to step on a pig in the dark. And that's how they did it, one stubborn ember at a time. Now here's a delightful little detail. They even changed how they breathed. Yes, when it's so cold that inhaling feels like swallowing icicles, you get creative. Deep breaths through your mouth? Terrible idea. That icy air went straight into your lungs, and in a world where pneumonia came with no health insurance and only a mild onion tea as treatment, that was a fast track to misery. So peasants learned what we might generously call survival breathing, slow, shallow, through the nose. It wasn't yoga, but it was close, if yoga came with hypothermia and smelled like cabbage and despair. Parents scolded children for panting like puppies indoors. Scarves and cloaks were pulled up over mouths at night, creating a sort of breath-warming barrier. Yes, you woke up with a damp, crusty patch of wool stuck to your lip, but better soggy than breathless. Even breathing became strategic, a matter of life and, well, sniffles, or worse. Children were trained young, shallow breaths, nose only, stay still, stay warm. It built character, or trauma, possibly both. Picture it. Under piles of cloaks, crammed between relatives, half dozing on straw, a cow breathing gently nearby, everyone breathing in sync, slowly, quietly, trying not to die. Like the worst group meditation class in history. But it worked. One slow inhale at a time. And if you're wondering what else helped in that long, frozen war against winter, well, it turns out a full stomach was one of the peasants' most powerful secret weapons. Now, if there's one thing medieval peasants understood instinctively, it was this: never go to bed hungry. Not because they were planning midnight snacks, but because calories meant warmth. A full belly was your best shot at not turning into a human icicle before sunrise. It's what you might call medieval thermodynamics. Eat something heavy, thick stew, porridge, chewy bread, and your body would get to work digesting it, like a tiny internal furnace gently radiating heat all night long. So what did dinner look like before a long, frosty slumber? Well, it wasn't pretty, but it was effective. Picture this: a big pot of something vaguely brown and steaming. Root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips floating in thick broth. Maybe some barley or oats. A hunk of rye bread dense enough to double as a doorstop. And if the family was especially lucky, perhaps after a festival or a particularly clumsy pig, There might be a scrap of salted pork or a sliver of sausage added to the pot. No one was taking pictures of these meals. There were no sprigs of herbs arranged just so. This was food designed to sit in your belly like a warm, heavy brick. A brick of hope. Fatty foods were treasured that burned slower, warmed longer, and reminded you bite after bite that survival sometimes tastes like lard. Little Thomas didn't like turnips. Tough. You eat the turnips, or you spend the night shivering and reflecting on your poor life choices. Medieval parenting in a nutshell. Of course, heavy eating came with side effects. Weird dreams. Restless nights. Cabbage-fueled visions of talking goats and dancing bread loaves. But still, totally worth it. Because at the end of the day, nobody was trying to feel light. They were trying to feel alive. And speaking of warmth, peasants had a few extra tricks up their sleeves. Enter the hay box and the heated stone, two of winter's most underappreciated heroes. The hay box was exactly what it sounded like. A wooden box stuffed with hay, used to store hot food and keep it warm for hours. You'd bury your stew pot deep inside, and by bedtime, voila, warm leftovers, no fire relighting needed. It was essentially the medieval slow cooker, just with more straw and fewer buttons. But the real bedtime champion? The heated stone. Someone, usually the youngest child, still small enough to be guilt-tripped, but large enough to carry a rock, would fish a big flat stone out of the hearth. Roasted to just below dangerous, it was carefully wrapped in cloth or rags and tucked under the hay mattress or down by your frozen feet. The result? Bliss. For a few hours at least, a little pocket of warmth that made all the difference. Of course, mistakes happened. Wrapping it poorly? You've got yourself a flaming pillow. Dropping it? Broken toe. But when it worked, oh, it worked. It wasn't luxury, it was survival, with a touch of ingenuity. Because for peasants, luxury was waking up without ice on your eyebrows. And finally, we return to the center of all things, the hearth. It wasn't just a fire. It was the beating heart of the home. And when bedtime came, it doubled the seating chart, life insurance, and very unofficial family ranking system. Sleeping close to the fire? That was prime real estate. Reserved for infants, elders, the sick, and anyone the family collectively agreed was too precious or too fragile to freeze. The rest of the household fanned out from there, forming layers of human insulation like nesting dolls made of wool and snoring. Of course, fire proximity had its risks. Too close, and you might wake up with crispy bangs or a suspicious burn hole in your blanket. Too far, and you might as well have pitched a tent in the yard. The heat didn't spread evenly either. The hearth was great at toasting whatever was directly in front of it. Everyone else had to angle, shift, and jostle for a sliver of that narrow cone of warmth. It was like sunbathing in winter, if the sun was a moody pile of sticks and the beach was full of livestock. And if you managed to fall asleep facing the fire, congratulations. One side of your body was delightfully warm, the other frozen solid. You might actually be able to knock on your own leg. But through all this, through the ash and smoke, the goose-downless beds, the stew-fueled dreams and goat-scented blankets, medieval peasants endured. Not with comfort, but with cleverness. With layers of cloth, clever breathing, shared meals, shared heat, and a refusal to give in to the cold. One ember, one blanket, one shallow breath at a time. So tonight, as you snuggle into your climate-controlled bed, adjusting your pillows just so, and choosing between two types of cozy socks, spare a warm thought for those long-ago villagers. They didn't have electric blankets or scented candles, but they had each other, and a very hot rock in a hay mattress. Sleep well and stay warm. Now, while the hearth may have been the heart of the home, let's not forget the rest of the household. the furry, feathered, and four-legged members who had opinions about bedtime arrangements. Dogs would curl up dangerously close to the fire, tails wagging a little too near to open flame, as if daring fate. Chickens would perch like tiny sentinels on the hearthstones, clucking softly, guardians of warmth with beady eyes and warm feathers. Every crackle of burning wood, every sleepy hiss of ember was a gentle reminder. You're still here. You're still warm. For now. And so, the household, humans and livestock alike, drifted into a kind of shared, uneasy sleep. Breaths puffed into small clouds, rising like prayers into the cold rafters, lingering just outside the fragile circle of warmth. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even particularly comfortable. But it was life, holding fast to the glow of a few coals, stubbornly refusing to let go. And in the medieval world, no one made it through winter alone. Survival was a village affair. You didn't just watch your own fire, you watched everyone's. If old Tom's chimney stopped smoking, someone noticed. And yes, maybe Tom still owed you a chicken, but that wasn't the point. A quiet house was a danger sign. Silence, in the dead of winter, was something you listened for. Villages had their own watchkeepers, usually the elderly who had long since stopped farming, or the young who hadn't started yet. These unofficial guardians noticed who hadn't come to the market, who was coughing too hard, who hadn't been seen since the last snowfall. Think neighborhood watch, but with more sheep and fewer clipboards. If a family's fire died, it was nearly an emergency. A good neighbor would rush over with a glowing coal wrapped in rags. A great neighbor would open the door and say, "Come in. We'll squeeze you in somewhere between the pig and grandma." Because 4 more bodies meant less space, less air, but more warmth. Even the food was shared, when it could be. Communal stores were small, but a handful of barley here, a strip of dried meat there. It could stretch the village just far enough. No one had much, but some was better than none. Children helped too, delivering wood, running messages, learning early that winter didn't care if you were tired. Everyone had a role. Everyone mattered. And yes, of course, villages had their feuds. Someone always borrowed someone else's good pot. Someone's goat always wandered where it shouldn't. But winter had a way of quieting arguments. Because when the wind howled at your door, even the neighbor who stole your best turnips was worth keeping alive. In those deadly months, the village became one big, slightly dysfunctional, deeply determined family, clinging together, laughing when they could, and surviving one frozen sunrise at a time. And through it all, they did one more thing. They prayed. Because when all else failed, when the fire dimmed, the roof creaked under snow, and the icy air crept in like a slow breath from beyond, peasants turned to faith, not just for Sundays, not for show, but for real, desperate, heart-on-your-sleeve hope. Before bed, families knelt on straw-strewn floors, whispering hurried prayers. Prayers for heat, for strength, for toes still attached in the morning. Saints became household names, guardians of lungs, of warmth, of mercy. Saint Blaise for the throat. Saint Nicholas for protection. Even old holy water was sprinkled by the hearth, just in case it worked on spirits or drafts. Some chalked holy symbols over doorframes. Some lit blessed candles. Some made deals with the heavens. If you just get us through this night, I swear I'll stop cursing at that one goat. Faith was woven into the walls, into the blankets, into the long, dark hours. And whether or not the prayers were answered, well, most nights, they were still alive to pray again tomorrow. But sometimes, winter won. Despite every muddy patch, every shared meal, every ember banked and prayer whispered, sometimes the cold crept too far in. Sometimes the snow fell too hard. And sometimes spring arrived to find not laughter but silence. Houses empty, fires out. Villages vanished beneath a heavy white shroud. Because this was life in the Middle Ages. not fair. Not easy, but fierce. And even in the face of frost and fear, medieval peasants met winter with cleverness, courage, and the sheer, unrelenting will to carry on. One ember, one breath, one shared bowl of stew at a time. Now, not every winter was merely uncomfortable. Some were downright cruel. Take the winter of 1315, for instance. A season so miserably cold and soggy it managed to go down in history as the opening act of the Great Famine. That year, relentless rains destroyed crops, livestock starved, and what had already been a tough existence turned into something much worse. A slow, wet, freezing disaster with no intermission. People grew so desperate that even the unthinkable became thinkable. There were whispers, only whispers of course, about eating shoe leather, tree bark, and, in the most dreadful cases, each other, which really puts complaining about burnt toast into perspective. You see, losing your fire back then wasn't just annoying. It wasn't, "Oh no, we're cold for a few hours." It was often the end of the story. Without that one stubborn flame, families huddled together for the final time. And when spring finally arrived, neighbors would sometimes find whole households still embraced, frozen together, as if trying to borrow just one more breath of warmth. Houses, too, had their breaking points. Roofs gave way under the weight of snow or the battering of ice storms. A midnight collapse wasn't a home repair issue. It was often fatal. And dragging yourself through waist-high snow to beg a place by someone else's fire, well, that depended on whether they had enough warmth to share. Disease, of course, never missed a party. The cold weakened the body, and those cozy-sounding smoky huts, perfect for pneumonia, bronchitis, and all manner of medieval respiratory adventures. A cough in December could easily become a funeral by January. And then there was frostbite. Quiet, creeping, cruel. Fingers, toes, ears, blackened and lost while still technically yours. Many survived the winter, but not all of them made it through with every piece attached. A chilling reminder, quite literally, that winter always took something. But perhaps the most haunting thing about it all is how normal it was. There wasn't some dramatic crescendo, no violins, just quiet acceptance. Every year people understood. Some of us won't see the thaw. Death wasn't a surprise guest. He was just another neighbor, wrapped in frost, standing quietly at the door. And yet, somehow, the peasants pressed on, stubborn, grieving, endlessly adapting, clinging to the one ember left in the hearth, watching their breath curl into the dark, frozen air and thinking, "Not today, winter. Not yet." When we look back at these muddy, frostbitten survivors of endless medieval winters, it's tempting to see only their misery, the cracked hands, the freezing toes, the smoke-choked huts with livestock snoozing far too close for comfort. But there's something else buried beneath all that hardship, something warmer, a quiet brilliance, a kind of homemade resilience stitched together from hay, moss, and sheer human will. They didn't have central heating, no thermal layers, not even a reliable mattress. But what they did have was an unmatched talent for staying alive, together, in spite of it all. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every ember gently banked beneath ash, every gap packed with damp cloth or sheep hair, these were not signs of desperation. They were tiny acts of innovation, survival, one stubborn patch at a time. Because when the world froze over, they didn't give up. They adapted. They learned from the land, from each other, from the bitter teachings of every winter that came before. And most of all, they learned that no one survives winter alone. Their communities were forged in frost, built not just on shared soil, but on shared survival. They watched over the sick. They shared coals and food and shelter. They taught their children that generosity wasn't charity, it was policy. If you gave warmth today, someone might return it tomorrow. And their faith, too, wasn't just ritual. It was resilience, a kind of quiet defiance disguised as prayer. Not just fear-driven appeals to heaven, but something else. Something softer. Hope. Hope that tomorrow might be slightly less cold. That spring would come. Eventually, that this whole shivering mess was worth getting through. And somehow, it was. Because of them, we're here. Because of their cold fingers and sleepless nights and relentless courage, warmth became a given instead of a goal. Comfort became normal. Survival became history. So tonight, as you settle under your cozy blanket, with the gentle hum of central heating in the background, spare a quiet thought for them, the original experts in staying warm against all odds. They didn't just survive winter, they defeated it, one cold, brilliant night at a time. Their blood, sweat, and ingenuity, all of it lingers with us still. Though we may not see it, it's stitched invisibly into every cozy blanket, every warm house, every sleepy winter evening where we sip tea by soft electric light, wondering vaguely whether it might snow. Those quiet comforts? They didn't appear out of nowhere. They're the end result of centuries of stubbornness, of nameless, tireless people who refused one bitter night after another to let the cold win. So the next time the wind howls outside your double-glazed windows, maybe spare a thought for them. The frost-bitten few who turned survival into legacy. One ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. Now let's drift forward. Not far, just a couple of centuries and a few rungs up the social ladder. Because our next story begins not with firewood and frozen fingers, but with a girl, a clever, spirited girl named Anne Boleyn. Anne didn't arrive in the world with a crown on her head or armies at her feet. She was born somewhere around the year 1501 into the bustling, ambitious Boleyn family. Her father, Thomas, was a rising diplomat. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from noble stock. But all things considered, Anne's birth barely rippled the surface of Tudor society. Still, from those modest beginnings, something remarkable was already stirring. Anne wasn't wealthy by royal standards. What set her apart was her mind. Sharp, curious, and utterly magnetic. Recognizing her potential, her family did something rather bold. They sent her abroad. First, to the glittering court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, where she brushed shoulders with Europe's finest minds and learned that diplomacy could be an art form. Then on to France, where Anne's spark was truly polished. She spent years soaking in the sophisticated air of Queen Claude's court, mastering the art of flirtation and politics, elegance and intrigue. While other young ladies were perfecting their embroidery, Anne was perfecting conversation, the kind that turned heads and shifted rooms. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, she was something entirely new. A woman who blended the refined manners of the French court with the rising ambition of an English house. Not traditionally beautiful, no, but striking. Arresting even. Dark eyes, quick wit, and a voice that danced like a lute string in motion. Anne didn't just walk into rooms, she rewrote them. At a time when a woman's role was often fixed by birth and marriage, Anne refused to blend in. She had seen what influence could look like behind a fan or beneath a veil, and she had every intention of using that knowledge at home. The girl who returned to England was no longer just Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was a player in a much larger game, and soon, that game would reach the crown itself. When Anne Boleyn stepped into the English court, it was like a gust of continental wind had blown through the tapestries. In a world of pale, obedient English roses, Anne was something else entirely. A thunderstorm, sharp, electric, impossible to ignore. Her dark hair and bold gaze unsettled people. So did her confidence. She spoke French like a native, danced like she'd invented rhythm, and laughed in ways that made people lean in, then wonder if they'd missed a joke. She was assigned as a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon, the king's first wife. But even in the Queen's careful shadow, Anne shimmered like a candle that refused to be snuffed. And people noticed. Men were intrigued. Women gossiped. The court buzzed with whispers about the unusual Boleyn girl. And then, inevitably, the king noticed too. Henry VIII, of course, was no stranger to courtly flirtation. His palace was practically built on whispered promises. But Anne? Anne was different. She didn't swoon. She didn't blush. She refused. And Henry? Well, Henry was not used to being refused. The more Anne kept him at arm's length, the more captivated he became. Letters flew between them, sweet, frustrated, lovesick. He offered her everything: titles, jewels, the unofficial but powerful position of royal mistress. And Anne, astonishingly, said no. She would not be just another name in the king's long footnote of passions. If he wanted her, he'd have to marry her. It was bold. It was dangerous. It was unheard of. Henry was already married. Catherine of Aragon wasn't just his wife. She was beloved by the people and fiercely defended by her powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. To make Anne queen, Henry would have to break not only his marriage, but with the church itself. And still, Anne didn't flinch. She had seen queens wield quiet power across Europe, shaping courts from behind silken curtains. She understood that ambition was a risky game. But it was a game she intended to win. Standing in the candlelit halls of the English court, Anne Boleyn made a choice. Not to be admired, not to be remembered fondly in a few ballads, but to change her fate, and England's, forever. What began as flirtation turned swiftly into something far messier and far more dangerous. King Henry VIII wasn't just smitten. He was obsessed. And in that obsession, he was willing to undo centuries of tradition. That's not hyperbole. It's just Tudor romance at scale. There was, of course, one small problem. Henry already had a wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon. Loyal, dignified, and very much not interested in stepping quietly aside. She had been his partner for 2 decades, through war, loss, and 6 pregnancies. In the eyes of the English people and the church, she was the rightful queen. Divorce at the time wasn't just frowned upon, it was unthinkable, scandalous, the equivalent of trying to delete your wedding from God's calendar. But Henry was determined. He insisted that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid, on the grounds that she had once been married to his late brother, Arthur. Never mind that the Pope had personally signed off on the whole arrangement years earlier. Details. Henry now claimed his soul was in peril unless the union was annulled. Convenient timing, really. Meanwhile, Anne played her role with remarkable precision. She didn't rush. She didn't swoon. She stayed just slightly out of reach. Every glance was calculated. Every word was careful. She wasn't just aiming for a crown. She was working to build it, 1 inch at a time. The court split like cracked ice. Some flocked to Anne, betting on a rising star. Others clung tightly to Queen Catherine, unwilling to accept her quiet replacement. Foreign ambassadors wrote frantic letters. Royal cousins threatened war. Henry's own advisors began to fidget uncomfortably in their velvets. And through it all, Anne held her ground. As the years dragged on, Henry's frustration began to boil. He bombarded Rome with petitions, surrounded himself with increasingly creative lawyers, and slowly realized something important. The church was not going to say yes. It wasn't just about Anne anymore. It was about control. Henry's pursuit of love, or perhaps legacy, had snowballed into a full-blown national and theological crisis. A king's heart had become a political earthquake. And through it all, Anne didn't just capture his affection. She became a force strong enough to reshape a kingdom. After nearly 7 long, scandal-packed, Pope-defying years, Anne's gamble finally paid off. In January 1533, she and Henry were married, secretly. A bold move, considering he was still technically married to Catherine, at least in the eyes of Rome and much of Europe. But Henry, true to form, charged ahead. By June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. But it wasn't exactly a fairy tale coronation. The people of London watched with narrowed eyes. Some cheered politely. Others muttered quiet prayers for Queen Catherine. And many wondered whether this bold, sharp-tongued new queen was a blessing or a very fashionable curse. Anne didn't glide into her new role with gentle charm. She stormed into it. Where Catherine had been humble, Anne was dazzling, political, brilliant, and, at times, terrifyingly direct. She wore bold colors. She didn't flatter easily. And she made enemies with the kind of speed that left courtiers breathless. Her throne was secure, yes, but only just. Because Anne understood, just as Henry did, that her future rested on one small, squalling, extremely specific condition. She had to produce a son. No prince, no protection, no legacy, no happy ending. So when she became pregnant soon after her wedding, the court leaned in. Henry was elated. Anne was confident. Everyone braced for the arrival of a boy who would cement the new queen's place and silence the critics. But in September of that year, Anne gave birth to a daughter. The child, of course, was healthy, bright-eyed, and destined for greatness. But her name was Elizabeth, and Elizabeth, unfortunately, was not a boy. To Anne's credit, she kept her composure. She smiled. She told Henry that next time surely would bring a son. She held the baby proudly and refused to crumble. Henry was less composed. The adoration in his eyes wavered, not vanished, but flickering, a dangerous kind of flicker, the kind that warned of storms to come. Still, for a time, Anne's star burned brightly. She reshaped the English court in her own image, sharp, elegant, and impossible to ignore. Her family rose with her, climbing heights they'd only ever dreamed of. And when she was crowned Queen of England, it wasn't just a coronation, it was a statement. Anne was the first queen in English history to be anointed with sacred oil, a rite usually reserved for kings. Her influence was vast. Ambassadors courted her favor, alliances were redrawn, and Henry, besotted, determined, and increasingly defiant, began to move England away from Rome entirely, creating the Church of England with himself at the head. All so that Anne's crown would be beyond question. But even at her zenith, the clouds were already forming, friends whispered, enemies circled, and Henry was beginning to glance sideways again. That restless royal gaze, once fixed adoringly on Anne, was starting to wander. Anne had claimed the throne, but holding it? That would take more than charm, more than wit, more than love. She had climbed higher than almost any woman of her time. And, as ever, the higher the climb, the sharper the fall. Almost from the moment the crown touched her head, the pressure intensified. Anne's greatest test, of course, was one she'd always known was coming. A son. Her first child, Elizabeth, was bright, healthy, and in time would become one of the greatest monarchs England ever knew. But in 1533, she was simply not male. Anne carried again, but her pregnancies ended in miscarriage. Grief followed, quietly and repeatedly. And with each loss, the cracks in her foundation deepened. Henry's passion faded into frustration, then disappointment. And Anne, never one to go silent, fought to keep his affection. She argued, she pushed, she held her ground. But Henry, who liked his queens obedient and his heirs male, grew tired of her fire, the very fire that once set his world ablaze. And outside the royal bedchamber, the wolves gathered. Many nobles who had grudgingly tolerated Anne's rise were ready for her fall. Catherine of Aragon's supporters never truly forgave her, and among the people, Anne's name carried more suspicion than celebration. Rumors painted her not as a queen, but as a temptress, a usurper, the cause of England's spiritual rupture. And then came Jane Seymour. Quiet, blonde, compliant. Jane was everything Anne was not, and precisely what Henry, now aging, anxious, and increasingly irritable, thought he wanted next. Anne saw it. Of course she did. She wasn't naive. She redoubled her efforts. Warm smiles, tender words, hopeful promises. But Henry was already slipping away. And someone else was watching closely. Thomas Cromwell. Once her ally, Cromwell now saw Anne as a threat to his vision of England. She wanted church reforms that would help the poor. He wanted control, stability, and royal favor. Their alliance fractured. And Cromwell, ever practical, made his move. Not with swords, but with something sharper: accusation. Anne Boleyn's enemies didn't need armies. They had whispers, secrets, and just enough fear to make it stick. Cromwell offered Henry an elegant solution. No need for another awkward divorce. That had gone badly enough the first time. No. What if Anne could be removed by disgrace? The charges were breathtaking: adultery, incest, treason. An entire soap opera's worth of scandal, packed into a single case. Cromwell worked in shadows, collecting evidence that bent flirtations into affairs and idle gossip into grand conspiracy. Confessions were extracted, some gently, others not. A handful of men were arrested, among them Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. The Queen, who had danced through French courts, outwitted ambassadors, and reshaped an empire, now stood accused of plotting against the very king she once captivated. The court that had once turned at her smile was turning again, but this time away. The charges, if one looked closely, didn't quite add up. Dates overlapped awkwardly, accusations contradicted each other, and some of the alleged misdeeds would have required Anne to be in two different castles at the same time, which, impressive as she was, seems unlikely without a teleportation spell. But in the court of Henry VIII, the truth had a curious habit of bending, usually in whichever direction the king happened to be facing. Anne knew it. She'd played this game before. She'd just never expected to be the pawn instead of the queen. She fought, of course, not with tears or hysterics, but with the same sharp intelligence and poise that had once captivated all of Europe. She reminded the lords, many of whom owed their titles to her rise, that she had been crowned with sacred oil, that she had been chosen, not just by a king, but, she believed, by divine right. But their eyes had already looked past her. Their minds were made up before she even spoke. And so, in May of 1536, Anne Boleyn was led through the gates of the Tower of London, not as a queen, but as a prisoner. Her trial was a performance, really. A bit of grim courtroom theater staged to give Henry what he wanted: a clean break, a tidy ending, and someone else to blame. Anne stood before her accusers, many of them men whose fortunes she had helped build. And now they sat in judgment, cool and unmoved, watching the queen they had once bowed to slowly unravel under the weight of the crown she dared to claim. The charges? Adultery, incest, treason, a tragic triple feature. She denied everything, calmly, clearly. She stood tall, even when the verdict was read: guilty. The sentence: death by beheading. A small mercy, if you can call it that. Most traitors faced far worse: hanging, drawing, quartering. But Anne would meet the sword instead of the rope. Even in that, Henry allowed just a glimmer of dignity. Back in her cold stone cell, Anne prepared herself, not for salvation, but for ending well. She prayed, long, steady prayers. not for deliverance, but for peace. For Elizabeth, for the people, and, perhaps in some quiet corner of her mind, for the man who had once promised her everything. Her ladies-in-waiting wept in the corners of the room, their sobs muffled by fear and stone. Anne, ever the iron thread beneath silk, comforted them instead. At one point, she even joked, wryly, that at least she would be remembered as the queen who quite literally lost her head. Dark humor, yes, but also something more, dignity sharpened by sorrow. Henry, for his part, was already looking ahead. His courtship with Jane Seymour had accelerated with all the tact of a thunderstorm. Wedding plans were whispered even before Anne's execution date was set. For Anne, that must have been the final betrayal. Not the trial, not the lies, but knowing she'd been replaced before she was even gone. On the evening of May 18, 1536, Anne was told she would die the next morning. She didn't sleep much. Few would. Instead, she prayed, not for herself, but for mercy on England, mercy on her child, mercy on those who had condemned her. Henry, in what passed for royal grace, had summoned an expert French swordsman for the deed. No English axe, dull and clumsy. No multiple blows, just one clean stroke. It was a strange kindness. But then, in Henry's world, kindness was always transactional. Anne Boleyn, once the storm that shook a kingdom, now waited in stillness. Her final night on earth spent not with regret, but with resolve. There were no hysterics, no begging. Just a woman who had once dared to believe she could reshape her fate, meeting it face forward. It was, in the end, a small mercy, a French swordsman, clean, swift. Probably more for Henry's conscience than for Anne's comfort, but let's not pretend the bar for royal kindness was particularly high. At dawn, Anne dressed with care, as if attending a formal dinner rather than her own execution. A gray damask gown trimmed with fur, crimson kirtle beneath, regal, subtle, symbols of grace and sacrifice, not show. She pinned up her long dark hair, tucked it beneath a simple cap, and stepped out into the tower's courtyard, where the mist clung low to the stone and the air was thick with breath and silence. She had been queen. Now she was something else entirely. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn climbed the scaffold, not with defiance, but with poise. The kind of poise that unsettles even the most hardened observer. A small crowd watched, courtiers, guards, a few quiet spectators, perhaps some who had once cheered her rise. Now no one cheered. Anne looked pale, thinner, but her eyes were steady. She spoke briefly, choosing her words with care. No protests, no angry parting shots. Instead, she offered a prayer for the king. Yes, that king. The one who had dismantled a kingdom to marry her and then dismantled her when the wind changed. She forgave him, out loud, in front of everyone, because in the end, Anne Boleyn chose grace, even when the world gave her none. The French executioner stepped forward, sword in hand. Anne knelt upright. No block, no flinching. Her hands folded, her eyes lifted to the heavens. A white cloth was tied gently over her eyes. The sword flashed, just once, and that was the end. No grand ceremony, no royal procession. Anne Boleyn, once crowned with gold, was buried in an arrow chest, a box meant for storing military gear, not queens. No coffin had been prepared, no epitaph carved. History simply closed the lid. But as it turns out, Anne didn't stay quiet. Not really, because in a twist, even Shakespeare might have considered a bit too poetic. The daughter she left behind, Elizabeth, would become one of the greatest monarchs England has ever known. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the Queen of Shakespeare, of sea power, of Golden Age glory. The woman who would face down Spain's armada, rule alone with steady hand, and usher in an era of art, ambition, and empire. All from the legacy of a mother buried in a borrowed box. Anne Boleyn did not win by surviving. She won by shaping the future. She cracked the foundations of a church, redrew the lines of power, and proved, terrifyingly, that even the brightest lights can be extinguished by shadow. But also that they can leave embers behind, embers strong enough to become flame. She was not perfect. She was bold, flawed, ambitious, clever, very clever, and she paid the price for it. But in the end, Anne didn't disappear. She became legend. And now, with the Tudor court finally quiet, we drift across the Atlantic where another storm is brewing. The year is 1770-something, and the American colonies are, how shall we put it, simmering, like a pot left too long on the back burner. At first, they had been loyal children of the British Crown. But lately, that crown was feeling a bit heavy-handed. And sticky with taxes. It didn't start with tea. No, that comes later. It started with paper and playing cards. And a curious little invention called the Stamp Act. But we'll get into all that soon. For now, let's pause here. Take a breath and let the echoes of Anne's footsteps fade into the stone. Tomorrow, we'll talk about protests, pamphlets, and a harbor full of soggy Earl Grey. Sweet dreams. In the end, it wasn't a musket or a marching army that tipped the colonies toward open defiance. It was tea, crates of it, stacked neatly in the hulls of 3 British ships floating patiently in Boston Harbor. It looked harmless enough, just another shipment, a touch of luxury, really. But tucked among the fragrant leaves was a final insult, one that would quietly detonate the American Revolution. Because in 1773, Parliament made a mistake. Not a loud one, not the kind with soldiers or sabers. It was a quieter misstep, the sort of thing that looked reasonable in a spreadsheet. They passed the Tea Act, which, on paper, was brilliant. It let the struggling East India Company sell directly to the American colonies. No middlemen, cheaper prices, better tea, a win-win. Surely? Well, not quite. You see, the price wasn't the problem. It was what came with it. The Tea Act still carried that small, lingering tax, the one the colonists had spent more than a decade protesting. Buying the tea meant accepting the tax, and accepting the tax meant accepting Parliament's right to tax them at all. For many colonists, especially in places like Boston, that was unthinkable. Like being insulted and then asked to smile because the insult came with a discount. Word spread like wildfire. Merchants were outraged, fearing monopoly. Patriots were livid, seeing tyranny in disguise. And in taverns and town squares, the people of Boston began to mutter, louder each day, that perhaps they'd had enough. Refusing the tea became a litmus test. Drink it, and you were a loyalist. Dump it, and you were part of the cause. And in Boston, where the scars of the Boston Massacre still lingered on cobblestones and in memory, the cause was growing teeth. 3 ships arrived in Boston Harbor, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. They carried the tea, and they would not leave. For weeks, they sat anchored, stalemates bobbing gently in the winter tide. British officials demanded the tea be unloaded. Colonists refused. The tension was unbearable. Even the seagulls probably stopped squawking. Inside the Old South Meeting House, a storm was brewing. Thousands packed the wooden hall. Farmers, blacksmiths, lawyers, sailors, standing shoulder to shoulder, breath fogging in the cold air. Fiery speeches lit the room like tinder. Votes were passed, fists were raised, and one thing became clear. This was no longer about tea. Under British law, imported goods had to be unloaded and taxed within 20 days. That deadline was now looming, and if the tea was still on board, British customs would seize it and collect the tax by force. To many, that was the line. The moment when protest would no longer be enough. Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson wasn't budging. The law was the law. Letting the ships leave, he believed, would mean letting mobs rule Massachusetts. And as far as London was concerned, the Crown didn't negotiate with mobs, so there it was. 3 ships, crates of tea, a ticking clock, and a city poised on the edge of history, because when the deadline hit, Boston would have a choice: obey quietly, or do something the world would never forget. By morning, the news had already spread. Boston Harbor wasn't just a port anymore, it was a message. 342 chests, over 90,000 pounds of tea, gone. The British East India Company, the crown jewel of imperial trade, had suffered one of the most precise and symbolic acts of rebellion in modern history. Not a single life was lost, not a single coin stolen, but the damage was incalculable. And London? London was furious. The Boston Tea Party, as it would come to be known, stunned the empire. It wasn't just the destruction of property. It was the defiance, the clarity of the message, and the frightening unity of it all. These weren't fringe radicals or drunken mobs. They were merchants, laborers, farmers, young sons of old families, quiet men who had knelt beside hearth fires, now standing as symbols of something altogether new. A people who would not be ruled without their consent. In Parliament, the response was swift and severe. Within weeks, the British government rolled out a new set of laws meant to punish Massachusetts and reassert control. Officially, they were called the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, they had another name, the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston, closed, no ships in, no ships out. Trade strangled. The colonial charter, revoked. The government now under direct royal control. Town meetings, banned. Royal officials accused of crimes, tried in Britain, not America. British troops quartered in colonial homes, by force. Boston, once the heart of resistance, was now a city under siege. But instead of breaking the colonies, the punishment backfired. Where Parliament had hoped to isolate Boston, it galvanized the rest of the colonies. Supplies poured in from distant cities, flour from New York, rice from South Carolina, silver from Philadelphia. Colonists who had once squabbled over borders now stood together. For the first time, unity began to feel like destiny. And so in September 1774, in quiet halls of carpenters, guilds, and church basements, leaders from 12 colonies came together in Philadelphia. This was no longer protest. It was a Congress, the First Continental Congress. They debated, they argued, they compromised, but they spoke with one voice when they declared that the colonies had rights, not as gifts from a distant king, but as natural laws born with them. They called for a boycott of British goods. They called for militias to be ready. And they sent one final message to King George III. We are loyal subjects, but we will not be slaves. Back in Boston, the harbor still stank of salt and rotting tea. The ships were still, but the city was bristling. The Tea Party had come and gone. Just a single night. But in that single night, the fuse was lit. And across 13 colonies, from New Hampshire's snowy hills to Georgia's sweltering coast, a sleeping giant stirred. War was no longer a question of if, only when. Now, picture this. It's the morning after. Boston wakes up to the strange scent of salt water and steeped defiance. A few broken crates still bob about in the harbor, looking rather sorry for themselves. And the water? Well, let's just say if you'd dipped a biscuit in it, you'd have had the world's largest cup of politically charged Earl Grey. But this wasn't just mischief, no tavern brawl, no rowdy night with too much rum. This was something much rarer, an act of carefully measured, rather well-organized defiance, pulled off in the middle of the night with more discipline than most office meetings today. No one was hurt. No one looted. And heaven help the curious colonists who tried to sneak away with a handful of damp tea leaves. They were promptly scolded by the Sons of Liberty, who were still patrolling the docks like stern older brothers. This isn't a souvenir shop, they might have said. It's a revolution. By midday, the whole town knew. And as news spread across the colonies, by word of mouth, letters, and newspaper columns with a little extra ink and a lot of dramatic flair, the opinions came in fast. Among patriots, there was pride. A deep, swelling pride that ordinary shoemakers, blacksmiths, and farmers had stood up to the biggest empire on earth and tossed its favorite drink overboard. Among loyalists and moderates, there was something closer to heartburn. Destruction of property? Wasn't that a bit much? Governor Thomas Hutchinson, from the comfort of his rather elegant mansion, was livid. Not only at the loss of all that fine tea, but at the message it sent. If the king's authority could be dunked like a biscuit in Boston, well, where would it stop? Back in London, the reaction was, shall we say, less than amused. King George III reportedly went cold with fury, which, for a man usually dressed in velvet and powdered wigs, is saying something. Parliament, already tired of colonial tantrums, absolutely erupted. This wasn't protest, they said. It was rebellion. And rebellions, as every empire knows, must be punished. Quickly and loudly, enter the coercive acts. Though in America, they were soon given a much catchier nickname, the intolerable acts. It began with the Boston Port Act, which, without so much as a please or thank you, shut down the entire harbor. No ships in, no ships out. Boston, in one swift move, was economically throttled. And it didn't stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act essentially took the colony's self-rule, folded it neatly, and filed it in the royal bin. Then came the Administration of Justice Act, which allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried back home in Britain, a lovely arrangement if you're the one being accused. And just for good measure, they added a quartering act. British soldiers could now be planted directly in your home. No invitation necessary. Just imagine opening your front door and finding a redcoat asking what's for supper. The message was painfully clear. Rebellion would not be tolerated. Liberty? A quaint idea, one that was now officially out of fashion in Parliament. But here's where the story turns, quietly, like a tide coming in. Instead of isolating Boston, Britain had accidentally turned it into a martyr. Food, supplies, and letters of support flooded in from other colonies. Farmers in Virginia sent grain. Masons in Pennsylvania sent tools. And pamphleteers sent words, sharp, stirring, unforgettable words. Boston, once just a city with cold winters and a tea-stained harbor, was now a symbol. A rallying cry. An entire movement stitched together by a shared sense of, well, if they can stand up to the crown, maybe we can too. In trying to break a city, Parliament had awakened a continent. What had once been Boston's problem was now America's cause. And somewhere, just over the horizon, the sound of drums, still faint, began to stir in the distance. And so, it happened. Just as empires always fear and rebellions always hope, a scattered people began to move as one. The punishment of Boston, so confidently handed down by Parliament, was meant to crush the spirit of rebellion. Instead, it forged a bond between colonies that had once regarded each other with polite distance and at times open disdain. For years, the colonies had been like distant cousins at a noisy family gathering, quarreling over trade, religion, borders, and pride. But after Boston's harbor was sealed shut and its liberties stripped away, a sobering truth settled across the continent. If it could happen to them, it could happen to us. From Virginia's plantations to the farmlands of Pennsylvania, from the Carolinas to the Rocky Hills of New Hampshire, Americans began to stir. Wagons full of food and supplies rattled toward Boston. Children packed candles. farmers sent corn, and printers rolled out pamphlets like cannon fire, sharp, fast, relentless. The message was clear. Boston would not stand alone. Then came September 1774, and with it, something entirely new. For the first time, 12 of the 13 colonies sent men to meet in Philadelphia, men who had once been local legends in distant places. George Washington, John Adams, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, now stood shoulder to shoulder in a gathering that felt less like a council and more like the stirrings of a nation in the making. They called it the First Continental Congress. Officially, they weren't talking revolution. Not yet. The goal, they said, was reconciliation. Perhaps, just perhaps, the king would listen. Perhaps Parliament would rethink. But beneath the polished speeches and carefully penned resolutions, a deeper truth was rising like a tide. The colonies could no longer afford to stand apart. They agreed to boycott British goods. They pledged mutual defense if violence came. And they made one thing painfully clear. An attack on one of us will be treated as an attack on all of us. In taverns, meeting houses, and village greens, the language began to shift. People no longer spoke of the colony of Virginia or the province of New York. They whispered a new word, one that had once seemed far too bold to say aloud: American. The winds of revolution no longer merely stirred, they roared, because in truth, the night the tea sank into Boston Harbor, it wasn't just tea that went under. It was the last illusion that the colonies could ever again be loyal subjects. What floated instead, dark and bitter on the water, was conviction. In the months that followed, that conviction hardened into preparation. The days of asking politely were gone. Now, town militias trained openly. Gunpowder was stockpiled. Farmers and blacksmiths drilled with muskets. And in the same taverns where loyal toasts to King George had once been raised, men now leaned in close and whispered of liberty and war. Boston had become a symbol. A city bruised, silenced, but never broken. And every ship that passed its sealed-off harbor carried more than cargo. It carried a warning. This is what tyranny looks like. Parliament had tried to scare the colonies into silence. Instead, it gave them a cause. A reason to stand, a name to rally under, a war to prepare for. By April of 1775, the tension that had gripped the continent for months reached its flashpoint. Just outside Boston, in the quiet towns of Lexington and Concord, British troops marched to confiscate colonial weapons. What they found instead were not scattered rebels, not frightened farmers, but ordinary men, standing in formation, their hands firm on muskets, their eyes steady with resolve. No one knew who fired the first shot, but once it rang out, crisp, sharp, and final, the world would never be the same. Let me know when you're ready to step into the first real clash of the Revolution, where redcoats met resistance, and the age of empires began to crumble beneath the feet of American resolve. Before the world knew pyramids, before pharaohs raised kingdoms along the Nile, before Stonehenge watched the skies from its misty hill, there was Carroll. And the world had forgotten. Tucked away in the parched Supe Valley of coastal Peru, a city had risen, not of myth, but of stone and spirit. Nearly 5,000 years ago, when most of the world still wandered, Corral was already building. And not just shelters, but pyramids, plazas, amphitheaters, observatories. A civilization in full bloom, hidden in a place where no civilization should have thrived. At first glance, the valley looks like the gods had turned away from it. Harsh, dry, bleached by sun and beaten by wind. A thin river winds through sand and gravel like a lifeline barely holding. No jungle, no lush bounty, just heat, stone, and dust. But to the people of Carroll, this land wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. They saw potential in the river's whisper. They saw rhythm in the wind. They saw not what was, but what could be. With no metal tools, no written script, no wheel to ease their burden. They built a city of vision. Their first conquest was water. The river, though modest, was life. With cunning irrigation systems, they channeled it across the dry valley. Fields once cracked and lifeless bloomed with green. Cotton, soft, white, and vital, became their crown jewel. It clothed them. It fed their trade. It linked them to the coast and beyond. Through trade, Carroll flourished. They exchanged cotton for fish and shells, goods for knowledge and culture, and their city, vast and carefully designed, reflected not war, but order, cooperation, and peace. No fortresses, no weapons. Not because they were naive, but because they were something rarer in history. A civilization that thrived without conquest. The architecture of Caral is a story in stone. 6 pyramids, broad public plazas, circular amphitheaters where music once rang through the desert night. Homes arranged with purpose. A city designed with thought, not mere survival. They watched the stars, charted the heavens, aligned their pyramids to celestial events. Their lives followed the rhythms of sky and soil. And yet, for millennia, Carroll slept beneath the sand. Travelers walked among the mounds, mistaking them for natural hills. Wind-worn and silent, the city held its breath, waiting to be found. It wasn't until the 1990s, when Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady began to dig, that the world finally listened. What she unearthed was not just ruins, but a revelation. Carroll rewrote the timeline. It forced scholars to rethink the idea that civilization had only flourished in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Indus Valley. Here, on the edge of the Pacific, human ingenuity had carved a kingdom from dust and done so peacefully. Caral was older than the Olmecs, the Maya, the Inca. It was the mother of Andean civilization and perhaps one of the first true cities on Earth. Now, as wind still sculpts the valley and the river still glimmers, Caral's stones whisper once more. They whisper of a people who worked together, traded widely, watched the stars, and believed that harmony was power. And this was only the beginning. So let's go back, not to battlefields or palaces this time, but to a sun-baked valley in ancient Peru, where something quietly astonishing was taking place. You see, while other early civilizations may have grown teeth, conquering, defending, building walls and empires, Carroll was building connections. Dried fish, cotton, woven goods, colorful beads, they flowed up and down the coast like the world's oldest Amazon prime. In return, Carroll welcomed the gifts of the distant and the strange, precious stones from the Andes, tropical fruit from lush valleys, seashells with colors too beautiful to be useful. Trade was not just a convenience, it was a philosophy. Carroll wasn't cut off from the world, it was stitched into it. And all of this in a place that most people would describe today as, well, a bit of a fixer-upper. But the people of Caral didn't see barren land, they saw opportunity. They worked with the desert, not against it, like early urban planners with excellent instincts and absolutely no tolerance for HOA meetings. They tamed the land, respected the river's moods, and grew not just crops, but community, order, and ideas. And then there were the pyramids. Not the tombs of pharaohs, mind you. No gold coffins. No trapped curses. These were not monuments to the dead, but platforms for the living. Rising from the earth like giant sandcastles left by the gods, Caral's pyramids defy every expectation we've had about what the New World was up to thousands of years ago. The largest pyramid mayor stretched over 450 feet long, standing nearly 60 feet tall. That's roughly the length of a football field and the height of a 6-story building, give or take a llama. It wasn't just large. It was engineered to endure earthquakes, using reed bags filled with rocks, like ancient shock absorbers, and it worked. The pyramid has stood there, stoic and sun-warmed, for nearly 5,000 years. Let that settle in. While humans were just figuring out bronze and wheels, Caral had already mastered cosmic architecture. Atop these pyramids, they didn't bury kings. They held rituals, lit sacred fires, and gathered beneath a blanket of stars to meet, worship, or simply be a part of something larger than themselves. At their base, circular plazas invited entire communities, not to war councils, but to celebrations, ceremonies, maybe even concerts. You just know there was a guy with a flute absolutely vibing. Their city was built for connection, with each other, with nature, with the sky. And here's the part that's really wild. No weapons have ever been found. No arrowheads. No fortresses. No evidence of warfare. There were no prisons. No moats. No trophy heads of conquered rivals. Not even a politely menacing warning sign. Caral was peaceful. That might not sound dramatic, but in ancient history, it's like showing up to a rock concert and finding a harp solo instead. Unexpected, but deeply moving. This was a civilization that gathered rather than conquered, that negotiated rather than invaded. It thrived not on domination, but on shared effort, patient trade, and maybe a little stargazing. Their cotton, spun lovingly by hand, was made into nets that linked them to coastal fishermen. In return, they got fish, salt, and stories. They shared what they had, traded for what they didn't, and wove a continent-spanning web of goodwill centuries before anyone else thought to call it infrastructure. At the center of it all was Caral, not a kingdom, but a beacon, not a war machine, but a symphony of community. And somehow, amid the heat, the wind, and the sands, their legacy lived on, quietly, gracefully, until we were finally ready to listen. Their stones still stand, and they whisper gently, not of conquest, but of cooperation. And perhaps that's the most powerful kind of civilization of all. Religious and ceremonial life played a vital role in maintaining social harmony. The city's grand public spaces and sunken plazas likely served as stages for rituals that united the people under shared spiritual beliefs. Music filled these gatherings. Flutes carved from condor bones, drums made from deer hides, creating soundscapes that echoed across the desert, tying individual lives to something greater. Leadership, too, appeared to rely less on military strength and more on spiritual authority and civic organization. The city's leaders must have coordinated massive construction projects, seasonal agricultural cycles, and complex trade agreements, all without leaving behind the brutal scars of war. In an ancient world so often defined by conflict, Caral stands as a shining exception, a reminder that civilization does not have to rise on the broken backs of the conquered. It can instead be built by the quiet power of collaboration, creativity, and trust. At Caral, the stones still seemed to hum with echoes of a world long gone. It was not just a city of buildings and trade. It was a city alive with sound, ceremony, and spiritual rhythm. Archaeologists digging carefully through the dry sands uncovered a treasure trove of ancient instruments, flutes crafted from the bones of condors and pelicans, whistles fashioned from deer antlers, small drums stretched with animal hides. These artifacts were not simple toys. They were crafted with care, tuned to specific notes, designed to carry sound across the wide-open plazas of the city. In a world without written language, music spoke the language of the soul. Imagine it, the low thrum of drums rising at dusk, flutes keening like the desert wind, feet stamping on the sunken plazas as hundreds gathered under the fading light. Fires would crackle atop the pyramid platforms. Priests, dressed in intricate woven garments, would chant to the gods of the river, the earth, the stars. In those moments, Caral was not just a city, it was a symphony. The layout of corral itself suggests that ritual life was at its core. The grand plazas were not mere open spaces. They were stages for communal ceremonies, carefully designed to draw people together. The sunken circular courts acted like ancient amphitheaters, focusing sound and sight onto the rituals performed at their centers. And above them all, the pyramids loomed, not as tombs, but as sacred mountains built by human hands, linking the earth to the heavens. Rituals likely marked the turning of the seasons, the cycles of planting and harvest, the movements of the stars. Music was not just entertainment. It was a bridge between people, between nature and the divine, between the known and the mysteries beyond. No violent murals, no terrifying gods of war, no bloodthirsty sacrifices. In Corral, the spiritual world seems to have been one of harmony, celebration, and reverence. Even today, when the desert wind whistles through the ruins, you can almost hear it. The faint strains of ancient music, the forgotten songs of a people who found beauty, meaning, and connection in the heart of the harsh, endless sands. Corral wasn't just a place of music, trade, and ritual. It was a marvel of engineering, a testament to human ingenuity in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. Without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals, the people of Corral shaped a city of stone and earth that has endured nearly 5,000 years. Their achievements were astonishing. Massive pyramids rose from the desert floor, constructed not with small, fragile bricks, but with enormous stones carried across the dry valley. Workers transported rocks using reed bags, ingenious baskets strong enough to bear heavy loads, woven from the very plants that grew along the riverbanks. Layer upon layer they built with care, stacking stone and filling the interiors with rubble to create structures that could withstand not only time but nature's fury. They understood nature well. Corral lies in a region prone to violent earthquakes, yet their pyramids and plazas survived largely intact. How? By mastering earthquake-resistant architecture. The builders used flexible construction techniques, layered fills, wide foundations, and rounded corners that allowed their monuments to absorb and dissipate seismic energy. It was engineering born not from textbooks, but from an intimate knowledge of the earth itself. Water management was another silent triumph. Despite living in a desert, the people of Corral developed sophisticated irrigation systems. Channels and canals carefully guided river water to their agricultural fields, allowing crops to flourish even during dry seasons. No water was wasted. Every drop mattered. The layout of Corral itself reflected brilliant urban planning. Major structures aligned with key astronomical points, suggesting a deep understanding of the solar cycles. The sunken plazas, with their precise geometry, were more than gathering places. They were instruments for tracking the heavens, allowing priests and astronomers to predict seasons crucial for survival. Even the city's organization spoke of a complex society. Residential zones, administrative areas, ceremonial centers, all were arranged in harmony, balancing communal life with sacred spaces. They built not just for the moment, but for generations. Today, as modern engineers marvel at Corral's resilience, they are reminded that greatness is not measured by technology alone. Sometimes the deepest wisdom lies in understanding the forces of nature, in working with the land, not against it. Corral's stones have endured storms, quakes, and the erosion of time itself. They stand as a silent testament to a civilization that engineered their dreams into the desert sands. For centuries, the city of Corral flourished, a beacon of peace, music, trade, and architectural mastery in the desert sands. And then, quietly, almost without a trace, it was abandoned. No fires marked its fall. No signs of conquest scar its walls. No mass graves or shattered monuments tell a story of sudden disaster. Instead, Corral simply faded, its plazas emptied, its pyramids left to the drifting sands, its flutes and drums silenced by time. Why did they leave? That question still lingers like a ghost across the Super Valley. Some scholars believe that environmental change struck the final blow. Evidence suggests that a long period of drought may have crippled Corral's agriculture. Without the river's life-giving waters, the fields would have withered. Trade networks dependent on surplus cotton and food would have faltered. The careful balance Corral had maintained with its harsh environment may have finally tipped beyond repair. Other theories point to shifting trade routes. As neighboring cultures grew and new centers of power emerged along the coast and inland, Corral's influence might have diminished. Perhaps the goods they once supplied, cotton, fish, produce, were no longer enough to sustain their role as a dominant city. Slowly, the lifeblood of commerce drained away. Still others whisper of internal decline. Without written records, we can only imagine political struggles, religious upheaval, or simple exhaustion after centuries of growth. Even peaceful societies can fracture under pressure when survival becomes uncertain. Whatever the cause, the departure seems to have been gradual, not sudden. Families likely drifted away one by one, seeking more fertile valleys, stronger rivers, new beginnings. Children who once ran across Corral's plazas grew up telling stories of a lost city behind them. Stories that would eventually fade into legend. The desert reclaimed what humans had built. Winds carried fine sand over stone temples. Flutes lay buried beneath shifting dunes. What had once been a humming, vibrant civilization became a field of silent, sleeping mounds. For nearly 4,000 years, Corral remained hidden, a whisper beneath the sands, waiting. Today, as archaeologists carefully uncover its stones, the question still burns. How does a city so advanced, so beautifully crafted, simply vanish? Perhaps the truth is that even the greatest civilizations, no matter how wise or peaceful, are still fragile, threads woven into the tapestry of time, forever vulnerable to the unseen forces of change. For millennia, Corral lay forgotten, buried beneath the silent sands of the Super Valley. Travelers passed the strange, rounded hills that dotted the landscape, never suspecting that beneath their feet lay the ruins of a civilization older than the pyramids of Egypt. To them, these were just natural formations, mounds shaped by the wind and time. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the world would finally hear Corral's voice again. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Soup Valley, driven by curiosity and a growing sense that these hills might hold secrets no one had yet uncovered. What they found would rewrite the story of human civilization in the Americas. Layer by painstaking layer, the sand was brushed away. Beneath it emerged walls of carefully cut stone, grand staircases, sunken plazas, pyramids, a city far older than anyone could have imagined. Radio-Arban dating confirmed the unbelievable. Corral was over 600 years old, thriving at the same time as the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. It was a discovery that shook the foundations of archaeology. Before Corral, scholars believed that civilization in the Americas developed much later, shadowed by the great empires of the Old World. Corral changed everything. It proved that the Americas had birthed monumental architecture, complex urban life, and social organization independently long before the rise of the Incas or the Mer. Ruth Shady and her team found not just stone and rubble, but the remnants of life, musical instruments, fishing nets, textiles, ancient knot records, and even offerings made to the gods. Each artifact told a story of a people who had built a society with vision, intelligence, and profound creativity. Corral's rediscovery was more than an academic triumph. It was a resurrection. A civilization that had slept beneath the desert for thousands of years now stood revealed under the open sky once more. its plazas kissed by the same winds that had once carried the sounds of flutes and the laughter of children. Today, Corral is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a fragile, priceless link to humanity's earliest dreams of building, belonging, and believing. The sands had hidden Corral well, but in the end the stones endured, waiting for someone to listen, to see, to remember. Corral stands today as a silent giant, a reminder that civilization's roots stretch far deeper than we once believed. Among its pyramids and plazas, the ancient stones whisper a story that reshapes our understanding of humanity's journey. A story not of conquest and bloodshed, but of harmony, ingenuity, and hope. Long before the towering empires of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt, the people of Corral were building something extraordinary. They raised pyramids without the wheel. They mapped the stars without written records. They created a thriving society rooted in trade, music, ritual, and engineering, all without leaving scars of war upon the land. In an era often defined by conflict, Corral offers another vision of what civilization can be, a society that valued connection over conquest, knowledge over domination. It reminds us that complexity does not require violence. That greatness is not measured by how many armies march across a battlefield, but by how a community comes together to build, to create, to dream. Corral's legacy reaches far beyond the dry sands of the Soup Valley. It challenges old assumptions that civilization had a single cradle, that urban life and monumental architecture belonged first to the old world. Corral proves that humanity's spirit of innovation and aspiration arose independently in many corners of the earth, shaped by different hands, but driven by the same eternal desires to endure, to celebrate, to reach toward the divine. Today, walking among Corral's weathered ruins, you can almost hear it. The pulse of drums, the low hum of flutes, the murmur of traders bargaining in the plazas, the laughter of children racing through stone alleys under a sky of endless stars. Their lives, their dreams, their stories are still with us, etched into the bones of the earth. Corral teaches us that even when civilizations fall, their spirit can endure, sleeping under sands, waiting to be remembered, waiting to inspire again. In the great timeline of human history, Corral shines not just as a relic of the past, but as a beacon for the future. A reminder that even in the harshest deserts, even under the heaviest sands, the seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can take root and build a world that reaches for the stars.